So Isha and I are really excited to have this very, I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation because Isha's sort of pushed me to, I can be very sort of like, you know, there's so many amazing things that we can do, but to really question sort of like, what are the challenges? So I think it's going to be exciting. So we're going to start out, Isha and I, and first give like a minute or two intro about what we're doing now. And then we'll each answer a few questions and then we'll open it up and hear all the brilliance you all are going to bring. So I'm going to, Isha, do you want to go first and tell us sort of what you're working on in this space?
Sure. So it's great to see everybody, many familiar faces, including Jacqueline, the first PhD student I ever had. So that's always a special place in my heart. There's never a second, another first. So it's great to see you, and just lovely to be here with old and new friends. So I wanted to, so as many of you know, um, I've been here 20 years almost, so many of you are known to me actually at this point. I have done a lot of work in water and sanitation and other resources more broadly, but really preponderantly water and sanitation at household and community levels in many countries around the world, usually under-resourced areas, including, unfortunately, California's Central Valley, but in many under-resourced areas, and have worked mainly at the community scale or the household scale. And so much of my work has been in looking at, what safe water technologies can look like, what is affordable, what is acceptable, what works for, culturally and sociologically and economically for these very under-resourced communities who are lacking a basic human right to safe drinking water and basic hygiene. And I think that I want to say that I came very much from that classic position of, these are under-resourced areas. So what technologies, financing, and so on are going to work in places that are under-resourced, that are basically, not going to be provided with the kind of systems that we have here in Berkeley. And I don't think that in the beginning I fully understood how much my work and the work of many other people like me, by no means am I alone, I don't think I fully understood or appreciated or perhaps acknowledged how deeply the work I did was premised on the assumption that these people are never going to get pipe disinfected water. So what are we going to do? So when I used to tell myself, well, or tell people in talks, we're not sure of what is, culturally, socially, economically sustainable for these communities, my unspoken add-on, which remained unspoken mainly, but my unspoken add-on was because they're not going to get pipe disinfected water. So given that, what can we do? And I think that I've kind of learned over time to kind of acknowledge that unspokenness and make it more transparent and accept that it is not that we don't actually know how to get water to poor people. We kind of do. But are we going to do it? Or are we going to look for these alternative low-cost methods because that's what we've decided that we can do? And I feel like and that understanding or that acknowledgement, maybe that transparency that I'm forcing on myself now that I may not have done in the early part of my career, has caused me to see not only some of the great strengths of community-based organization and community-based activism, but also some of the limits when it comes to safe water and sanitation. It isn't always the way to serve communities. There are some communities that will take them a long time to have the kind of financial and managerial capacity that you need to have community-based systems work well. And I guess I'm no longer convinced that Ostrom-like background that I came from, which is local, community, decentralized, actually a lot of what we just heard in the talk previous to this, is necessarily the way to supply clean drinking water as a universal human right to all. I think I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, wow, very provocative. And it's going to be great to sort of, I think it's what's great for everyone in the room is that Isha and I are coming from different perspectives and almost like different dimensions of the issue. So what am I doing now? So I entered ERG in 1997, and hello to the homies out there from my class here. So for the last 6 years, I've been founder and head of a technology nonprofit called Atma Connect. And we've built a platform for neighbors helping neighbors called Atma Go that's reached over 7 million people in over 100 locations in Indonesia and Puerto Rico, and is helping people prepare for, respond to, prevent disasters, take community collective action, advocate with governments, and spread effective solutions. It's really based on the premise, one thing that I came to this with is that people are resourceful and ingenious, and let's stop telling them what to do and use the entire development infrastructure to tell them what to do and extract their information. So this is really very much about transforming the dynamics of power, creating people as agents in their own change. And so we have loads of statistics about the economic losses that are avoided and years of healthy life that are saved in disaster, impact during COVID-19. But fundamentally what this is about helping marginalized people build ground up power so their voices are heard and their needs are met. And it's really been sort of a stream in my entire professional career. I worked on environmental justice in the United States before this, and on water and sanitation issues globally before that. So Isha and I are each going to answer 2 questions. The first question, Isha, is why are you so motivated by or interested in the approach of community participation or community-driven solutions?
Thank you, Meena. So I came to the world of water through that mode. That was really my entry point. I've always worked in low-income areas.
Research school and Earth system modeling.
I have a
So,
strong sense.
Lisa and I were chatting about this, but can you describe how you do this quick transition now from philosopher to climate
economist? I can't mute them quickly.
Carter,
Yeah,
I think that's
so I mean, I always knew that the philosophy thing was my undergraduate degree, and then I just stopped after that. So I never had any plans to become a full-time philosopher or anything like that.
Everyone. So someone. Okay. It's
Right.
happened. Thank you. Sorry about that, Isha. Please proceed.
So I think I always came into, since I've always worked in low resource communities, I think I came to my work kind of very motivated and guided by Eleanor Ostrom's work on, there is an alternative to a state monopoly or a privatization and enclosure. There is an alternative. Communities are empowered. Certain kinds of communities, have within them the capacity to self-organize, self-regulate. And there were so many examples of this clearly being true and I still feel that there are so many areas where that clearly is absolutely spot on, that I kind of naturally came into the world of water through that framework of it doesn't have to be a state monopoly, which is good because the state is absent most of the time in many of these places. And it doesn't have to be enclosure for privatization, which is good because we know whom enclosure will enclose out of. So it was a good thing in my mind. It was an optimistic and yet pragmatic framework, the community-based approach or the community-based natural resource management approach that I came from. And even now I feel that has a lot of promise. I'm just not as wedded to it as sort of the first It used to be my first port of call. What can we do as a community? I don't think it's anymore my first.
Well, I actually started working on that during my master's. So that's actually, so.
Okay, great. Isha, were you done there? Yes, okay, great. So I'm going to answer the question.
Why don't you take your turn? Yeah.
Okay, great. So why am I so motivated or interested in this approach? First, I probably entered ERG because of this. As you know, the stories of the toilets that were built that were used as grain storage facilities. So the first reason is effectiveness, is that we really need to put people who at the center of their own development in order for things to be effective and used. Second is justice. And, I think it was John Holdren that said there are three, parts of the climate future pie. There's adaptation, there's mitigation, there's suffering. That suffering is unequally distributed. We learned a lot about that in the previous talk. It's people of color, it's low-income communities that are unequally suffering. And when I was working in West Oakland on environmental justice, there was a woman there, Margaret, who said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so my life's work has really been about getting folks who are not heard, who are not at the table so that they can be heard and drive the change because justice. And, and then I also get, I guess the third reason I would say is the tyranny of the expert. It just frustrated me that, there were folks in Geneva and in Berkeley that knew about affordable water solutions, but, this kind of stuff wasn't coming from and getting to the people who needed it most, right? So it's sort of those are a few of the reasons that I'm attracted to this approach. Okay, so the next question is, what have you learned about how to approach this work, and what are the limits that you've seen?
I'm coming very much from a perspective of a particular set of resources around water and sanitation. And one of the things I want to point out from the beginning is that what I'm going to say, my lessons have been primarily from that domain. Resources are very different from one another. There isn't, there aren't, just as communities aren't homogeneous, nor are resources homogeneous. And what I'm going to say may not be as applicable to land or pastures, or, I don't want to, because the materiality of resources is very important. That is one thing that I have also come to appreciate even more than I did before, is that, at ERG, we really believe in the sort of social and the natural co-constituting one another, as Dick Norgard would say. It's a co-constitution process. They make one another. So the kinds of lessons I've learned about financing and other social issues, they are also affected by the sort of materiality and the conditions of the resource, the physicality of the resources that I deal with, which are really water and sanitation and wastewater and things of this nature. And I find that even smaller systems, not huge, smaller, what is decentralized, how decentralized, but smaller, much smaller than city scale systems even, they still have to have in the built infrastructure space a certain scale at which it makes sense to operate them and manage them. And that's why I think, that's where I feel that there can be sometimes limits to community action in the water and wastewater space, limits to full community management in the water and wastewater space. The community isn't always able to or willing to act at the scale that even a small water or wastewater system needs to act, to operate in order to be effective. I'm not even talking about high levels of efficiency, just even effectively managed, right? So that's part of it. And the other part is, to my mind, water and sanitation, they really are human rights. And it's not because the UN said so. The UN always lags, okay? Water and sanitation, clean water and sanitation are human rights. And when something is a human right, are there not risks to leaving the management and the provision of a human right to community by community, where communities may vary, not in just in capacity, but in their own internal democratization and its the principles they follow to run as a community? If we do that, I think we risk having high levels of variation in whether this human right will really fundamentally be met for all if we operate strictly at the sort of community level. So that's the other reason I'm a little concerned about a fully community-driven approach to the management of drinking water and wastewater.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to share some lessons from my work and encourage folks to add questions into the chat, and hopefully we can open it up for a conversation soon, and people can sort of speak their questions. So first lesson I would say is to be humble and unattached to the impact that you want to achieve. I learned this all the time through this work. But we originally started out, I come from the water sector. We originally started out as a way for low-income communities to share water price information to increase the affordability of water. We had funds from Cisco Foundation to achieve that, making water more affordable impact. But we were very focused on having users create the platform they most wanted and needed. And we kept asking people, how can we make this better for you? And they said, I'm unlikely to change my water vendor because I have a relationship with this person, but I'd really like to share a lot more than just water price information with my neighbors. And so we did what I feel like never happens in development. We threw away what we had built and rebuilt as this hyper-local social network. And suddenly it was being used in the ways that people really needed it. And so that's the first lesson. Be unattached to the impact that you think it needs to be achieved. Second, in working in these marginalized communities, I've learned that everything is connected. And you can't go in there trying to pull like sort of one silo in terms of, like the impact that you want to achieve. So I'll give you an example. In West Oakland, we created this environmental indicators project. They had, things that you would think of as environmental indicators that they chose, like air pollution, asthma rates, but also things like voting, how voting rates in the community and gentrification, all of which is connected. So as air pollution goes down, gentrification goes up. And so I see that again and again is sort of how we can't just pick out one piece of the puzzle, because in these communities and really globally, everything is connected. Everyone is brilliant and ingenious. I see that again and again. In terms of, and I want to, really just sort of say, I want to dig in a little bit more to the limits. So so the fourth issue is about the scale, which Isha is bringing up too. I had an obsession with scale, having worked on community projects. In comes technology, everyone has a mobile phone. And so here's the opportunity to create this global scale impact that is driven by communities and the oppressed. And and sort of looking at our backyard and why are ridiculous things like Facebook and Twitter reaching 1 billion people, how can we create something in development that reaches that scale? And there are things that I've had to do in this process that have made this not just a technology product, because in order to engage and empower the people that most need to be heard, we are doing citizen journalism trainings and digital literacy trainings. And our users have said, we really want to see change on the ground as a result of what we're sharing online. They frankly don't care about sharing things online unless it's going to change their lived experience. So we have much more we have many more things that are programs that are, not as scalable as, I originally had intended. And then the last thing I'll say is that what I find really hard is because of the centralization of capital, it's really hard for all of these incredible community projects to attract the capital that they richly deserve. And so I think that's the next challenge that I'm excited about unlocking. All right, so does someone want to?
There are good comments in the chat and questions already. Chad has a question. Emily has a question. Nancy has a question. So there are several out here. Does anybody want to just start us off?
Yeah. Yeah, Chad, I think you're right. Chad has sort of identified this. We do need to unpack the term community, and sort of, I think that Isha and I are talking about it in different ways, because in a way, and it's interesting because we're talking about networks of communities, which is also what's happening on our platform. But yeah, does it mean local? Or does it mean the oppressed, sort of folks that don't have the services or are not having their needs met? So I think that's a really important point. Chad, do you want to add to that? What are you?
No, not really. I'm curious to hear Isha's point, and I think it's something that I struggle with a lot in some of the contexts you were talking about, Meena, where there are high resource systems and low resource systems trying to come together, and they're calling each other communities, but they do it in very lumpy ways. And I just find it, in these contexts, it's sometimes a very difficult boundary drawing. So I was just curious to know how you all had thought about it.
It's always a little difficult to say community, Chad, because there are always sort of internal power structures within community also. I mean, there's hardly any, homogeneous community. It's just not possible. But when we are talking sometimes about the scale of services, we sometimes kind of, cover over the disparities within the community and kind of consider them to be like a community, understanding that there are distinctions and differentials within them, but still speaking about a sort of scale of operation, the way we would say neighborhood. So it's a meaningful term, but it's in some sense always also an inadequate term, in the sense that to the extent that it implies a certain simplifying homogeneity, we know that that doesn't really exist.
Yeah, it's sort of like if you take the concept of an ecosystem, which sometimes is very layered, it's very tempting, I think, sometimes to flatten that when you speak of community. So thank you.
It is. And I do recognize that it's an imperfect, it's a lumping together of the not always completely similar, for sure. Yeah.
Nancy, do you want to jump in here?
I hesitate to, because my mind is in a really different place, but I was sort of adapting what you were saying to what I deal with, which is California, electricity, and big wind energy, and coming off of Omar's talk.
Yeah.
But I struggle a lot with, there's been sort of a devolvement of decision-making to community level aggregators called CCAs. And so we now have 40 different communities trying to decide where they want to get their power, and with notions of doing it locally. But really, we're all connected in this one grid. And some communities, most communities, don't have wind energy resources. They may not even have, any place for large scale solar. And so you end up with relatively high cost solutions that are not really reliable. So anyway, it's all just sort of swirling in my head. But I was struck with by Isha's point that, if climate is a human right, do we just throw it on communities to figure it out? I don't think that works. I just don't see how it works in California. But anyway, that's just me.
Yeah, I think that that's a good point. And I guess following on from what Chad was distinguishing, I think that really what the difference, I think I'm thinking about it differently. Yes, we have it's a hyper-local social network that we have, but it's really about giving voice to the oppressed. And I think that in every situation, that's possible. I don't think the solutions are necessarily that they need to be at a community scale, which I think was also Isha's point.
Yeah, it doesn't. One of the things, Nancy, I can't make this analogy to your big point, which is climate, because you can't think about climate in the way that I'm just about to say, that you can sometimes think about electricity or water. And to my mind, I feel like we have to distinguish between a resource that is a resource and a resource that we're thinking about more like a service. And once you start thinking about something like a service, and this is where I think the analogy with climate completely breaks down, right? But once you think about something as a service, at that point is where I'm less willing to open it up to community-based management alone. I can't imagine what would happen to community-based management in this country if schooling was done community to community.
Well, it kind of is.
Decided primary schooling and secondary schooling is a service. It's a right. That's it. You get your kid there, right?
Although it is funded locally by property tax, which means that we have huge,
yes, which is why you see the vast inequities that you do actually, right?
Right.
So, but there are certain services, and I think every society has to come to terms with like, what are those services for us? And that may not be necessarily universalizable, but when you are thinking about it from a service perspective, that's the scale at which I think community-based organization isn't capable of guaranteeing either sustainability or equity. Mm-hmm. Often not capable of guaranteeing either. Mm-hmm. And I've come to see water as a service more than as a resource.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Emily, do you want to jump in here?
I don't really have a question. I think I had a comment that has already been addressed, but it's kind of interesting. I recently interviewed Naomi Klein, and so I read a lot of her stuff, and she makes this argument that we really need to move to decentralized forms of energy, because unlike fossil fuel, which tends to be held in these really centralized capitalist organizations, and unlike nuclear power, which is also kind of highly centralized, right? It's a match between the political power and the the sort of materiality of the power that has to be in the future. So I think there's this tension between, can communities, can they do it most efficiently? Can they do it with an adequate expertise versus, the sort of finance and politics, I guess, that go with that. So, and it might also just be different forms of energy, different forms of, resources or services that really require those different kinds of management and ownership.
Yeah. I do think that distinction between who, runs the service versus, now I'm kind of like, I think Chad's question really helped identify the differences here. So the kinds of things that people are taking community collective action on, let's say on our platform, is to get the government to do things that it's supposed to do. Mm-hmm. And so it's that kind. So I think that probably the title of the panel made it seem like we were really interested in like community scale infrastructure and management, but it's really about how do we have the folks that are at the, that are suffering the most lead the way to the future that we want. Okay,
there's a good comment here by Neo. I wonder whether Neo would be willing to just speak to it.
Sure, thank you, Isha. Let's see, I was putting out that the communities that you folks are talking about are sort of often somewhat disempowered, trying, as you said, to get government to do the right thing. And what I'm thinking is that there's these new communities that are emerging, such as those led by Greta Thunberg. And I think there's going to be huge disasters. I just think of when Bangladesh puts thousands of people on a boat and sends them to our coast saying, hey, you made the problem and what are you going to do about it? There's going to be huge famines, and this global change is not going to get any easier. So there's new emergent communities that will occur, and we should think about them, anticipate them, use their power to do what we want to get done. And I'm wondering if that's also in the community thinking, or is that just out there in left field or somewhere that's not really part of the dialogue?
Well, there are ways in which community is being reshaped and maybe rethought, perhaps not in a traditional way that Meena and I have worked, but different emergent forms of community really also going to Chad's point to some extent. Are we going to be closed off very soon now, Rashmi?
We are. Thanks,
Okay.
everybody.
Yeah, we have
Thank you.
1 minute left. So thank you
60
both.
seconds.
Yeah, Isha, you can finish your thought.
Yeah. No. That's all I meant was that, there are ways in which community is being rethought and reframed, perhaps through these new movements, which are not the traditional ways in which communities have really been worked with or thought of. How much staying power they have and at what scale they can operate, we don't yet know, of course. Yeah, but yeah, I think those are communities too. Those are communities in a very real sense. I agree. Yeah.
Well, thank you both in the last 20 seconds. Did you?
It's so great to see everybody. I just feel, I wish it could be a real seeing. Yeah.
Hopefully in a year or two.
Yeah.
For that. Thank you.
Thank
See you
you.
soon in the main.
Thank you, Meena and Isha.